Welcome to Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School. Do you know what a homograph is? Yeah, I didn't either. I had to look it up. A homograph is an English word for words that are spelled alike, pronounced alike, but mean different things. Let me give you an example. Can and can, as in I can do that, and as in a can of corn. Spelled the same, two entirely different meanings. One more example. Yard and yard. A yard is 3 feet, measure of distance. And a yard is a thing where you put your swing set so your kids can play. But we could go on and on with homographs. There's a homograph in the Bible in 2 Samuel chapter 7. It's an important one. It's important not only for understanding David, it's important for understanding the whole Old Testament, the whole rest of the Old Testament. And in reality, it's important for understanding the New Testament and where Jesus comes from too. The homograph that comes up in 2 Samuel 7 is the word house. And I want to go through 2 Samuel 7 with you in a little bit of detail because it's kind of an important chapter, especially the first part of it, and that play on the word house, the homograph on the word house. Now when the king dwelt in his house, 2 Samuel 7 verse 1, Yahweh had given him rest from all his enemies round about, so peace in the land. The king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar." And he's talking about a physical house, like the house I live in, the house you might live in. He says, but the ark of God dwells in a tent. And he sees a problem. He's made Jerusalem his political center, his political capital. He's made it his religious capital. But he has a palace, and God's house is a tent over the Ark of the Covenant. He wants to build a house for God. Nathan said to the king, "Go, do all that's in your heart, for Yahweh is with you." But that same night, Yahweh comes to Nathan and says, wait a minute. In verse 5, he says, "Go and tell my servant David, thus says Yahweh, would you build me a house to dwell in?" Now the house is more like a temple. "Would you build me a temple? I've not dwelled in a house since the day I brought up the people out of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I've been moving about in a tent for my dwelling." And some might argue that the tent is more indicative of the God of Israel than would be a permanent house. The tent, the tabernacle, moved around with the people. It was in the midst of the people all the time. If you build him a house, it's going to be in one place. If you build him a temple, it'll be in just one place. In verse 8, he says, "Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says Yahweh of hosts," or Yahweh Sabaoth, as we hear it in our liturgy, "I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel." Notice God doesn't call him king, but prince. "I've been with you wherever you went, have cut off all your enemies from before you." And he goes on and talks about the relationship that God had with David. And then if you come to verse 11, "From the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, Yahweh declares to you that Yahweh will make you a house." And now the word house changes meanings. Now it means something like a dynasty. "I will make a house out of you, David. I will make a dynasty out of your descendants." So the word house becomes a homograph in that it's pronounced the same, spelled the same, but means something entirely different. It says, "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom." And then he says, "He shall build a house." Now we're back to temple. "For my name." Not for me, notice, but for my name, God says. "And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." And verse 16, "And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." Verse 18, "King David went in and sat before Yahweh and said, Who am I, O Yahweh God, and what is my house?" Here the house means like family status. Who am I? What's my family status that you brought me this far? And yet this was a small thing in thy eyes, O Yahweh God, that thou hast spoken also of thy servant's house, dynasty, for a great while to come. The chapter goes on, and the play on the word house continues. But the idea is David comes to God and says, I'll build you a house. And God says, I don't need a house. I don't need a physical dwelling. Instead, I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to make a dynasty out of you, David, and someone in your line will sit on the throne forever. Now, if you know your New Testament, you remember some children as Jesus came into Jerusalem singing, Hosanna to the Son of David. Behind that line is all of this house stuff from 2 Samuel 7, this dynasty idea that Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of this king in the line of David who would sit on the throne forever. And God would do it for his people. It didn't make any difference what David was going to do. It didn't make any difference how he acted. It didn't make any difference how much he believed or how much he behaved. God was going to build this dynasty, and it would be fulfilled in a Savior, Jesus Christ. That's the kind of God we have, and that's what grace is all about. God acts not because of what people do, but in spite of what people do and on people's behalf. Thank God that we have God of grace.